What's up, everyone? It's Josh over here with the Manchise coming back at you for another UFC Fight Night card. Coming up here on Saturday night, we have Brunson versus Shahbazyan. Not the greatest card. I believe Holly Holm and Irene Aldana were supposed to headline this card. They dropped off the card. So now we have Derek Brunson versus Edmund Shahbazyan as our main event, but it will only be a 3-round fight. At least that's what I believe. I'm looking here on Tapology. With all that being said, we still have action. We still have a UFC card on Saturday night, so I'm going to break it down. We'll make some predictions for each fight. We'll look at things from a betting perspective and, as always, from a DFS perspective. Last week was a little rough for me, man. Had a lot of Grundy exposure. He lost. Had a lot of Herbert. He got KO'd by Trinaldo, and Gustafson ruined a lot of cards for me. So I did have a few cards that cashed, but overall it was not a good night for me. So hey, all good things must come to an end, right? I was on a nice little 4 or 5 week in a row hot streak there, but we're going to get back to the grind here on Saturday night, and we're going to kick things off with the first fight on the prelims, which is a fight between Chris Gutierrez and Cody Durden. Cody Durden is taking this fight on short notice, and this fight is going to be taking place in the 135-pound division, bantamweight, I believe that is. And we'll start off with Chris Gutierrez here, coming off of a pretty impressive victory against Vince Morales, where he TKO'd him from leg kicks. And he put up a crazy DFS score. If you didn't have him that night, that was about a month ago or 2 months ago, so it was pretty recent. Quick turnaround here for Chris Gutierrez. And he looked really impressive in what most people thought would be a pretty evenly matched fight, Morales versus Gutierrez. But his striking was just on another level, and Morales had no answer for those calf kicks. He's on a nice little 3-fight win streak here. The TKO to Vince Morales, and then 2 decision wins. One against Ryan McDonald, and the other against Geraldo de Freitas. I believe he's 3-1 in his UFC career. Let me just check that. Yes, he was subbed in his UFC debut. On the flip side, he's fighting Cody Durden, who is taking this fight on short notice, and he's got a record of 11-2. Hasn't really fought in any major promotions, though, mostly a regional fighter up until this point. He's on a nice little win streak. His most recent fight was actually just a week ago. He knocked out a guy by the name of John Sweeney. Sweeney had a 6-2 record. Before that, he was able to sub Veron Webb. Veron Webb had a 10-3 record. Dre Miley, he knocked him out 8 months ago. And then his fights before that were really against some trash cans. I just have to be honest. Jeremy Rogers, he subbed, 0-6 professional record. Dylan Schulte, 0-1. Can't put too much stock in victories over guys that don't have a ton of professional experience. But I will tell you that Cody Durden does train with a legit team, an American top team, Atlanta, trains with the Lima brothers, so he's definitely getting in some hard rounds there. When I look at this from a betting perspective, let me just pull up the odds. Chris Gutierrez is a pretty big favorite. It makes sense. It's -345. Cody Durden's +285. Gutierrez is the bigger fighter. He's the more experienced fighter. And, Durden has this super quick turnaround from his most recent fight, which was just a week ago. And he's taking this fight on short notice. So for that reason, I definitely lean Chris Gutierrez in this fight. I just think that UFC experience will really come in handy in this one. And I think he's probably the more polished striker. Cody Durden, though, isn't a slouch. I've been able to watch a few of his fights, and the guy's pretty well-rounded. His striking's decent. He definitely has some solid submission skills. So it wouldn't shock me if Durden pulled out a victory. Those odds, though, -345 for Gutierrez, +285 for Durden, they're just something that I want to stay away from. I don't expect to have too much exposure for this bout. from a betting perspective, and neither from a DFS perspective either. When it comes to DFS and DraftKings and FanDuel, Chris Gutierrez is one of the most expensive fighters on the slate. He actually is the most expensive fighter on the slate at 9,200. And again, it makes sense. He's a pretty big favorite. And if you just look at things from an experience, size, striking perspective, Gutierrez definitely has an advantage. But it's the first fight of the night. Durden, even though he's making his UFC debut, he's a guy that, he could be a sleeper here. So in DFS, I am definitely not going to pay up for Chris Gutierrez. 9,200, you're hoping for an early finish. So I am certainly not going to pay up for that 9,200 price point for Chris Gutierrez, because if you're paying 9,200 in DraftKings for Chris Gutierrez, you're expecting an early finish. And so far in 4 career UFC fights, we haven't really seen that from Chris Gutierrez. Obviously, his most recent fight against Vince Morales, he was able to finish that one with the leg kicks, and he did put up 120 fantasy points. Let's be honest, that's a pretty rare finish. You're not seeing guys get finished all the time from leg kicks. Before that, his 2 victories against DeFreitas and McDonald, he had solid performances, 64 points, 65 fantasy points. So if he doesn't finish Durden, you're looking at, probably anywhere from 65 to 75 fantasy points. He's not a guy that, he's mostly a striker, so you don't expect a ton of points from takedowns or advances. I think I'm going to pretty much stay away from this fight altogether. I don't plan on having too much exposure one way or the other. You could do worse at that $7,000 price point for Cody Durden, though. He's a guy that I don't expect to have a ton of ownership. And, that's a guy that you can throw in your lineup and win a GPP with, because he's the cheapest guy on the slate. As I mentioned, he's training with some top guys over at American Top Team in Atlanta. And who knows, maybe he's able to pull out a victory here. It's not like Chris Gutierrez is a world beater. So if I were to have any exposure to one of these fighters, it would be for Cody Durden, and it's really just a dart throw at that point. All right, so we're moving on to the next fight here, which is taking place in the featherweight division. It's Jamal Pretty Boy Emmers versus Timur Valiev. Just going over some of the numbers here. Jamal Emmers is 17-5. It will be his second fight in the UFC. He lost his UFC debut. It was a split decision loss against Giga Chikadze, and that fight took place about 4 or 5 months ago. On the other side, we have Timur Valiev, most recently fought for an organization called Guerrilla Fighting. I am not too familiar with that organization, but before that, he did fight in the PFL and was pretty successful there. He's got a couple victories in the PFL. He beat Bekbulat Magomedov by decision, Max Koga by decision as well, and Jose Naldo Silva. He was able to sub him via rear naked choke, and all of those guys had pretty solid records. Magomedov 19-3, Koga 19-4, and Silva 25-5. Valiev's been on a nice little winning streak here, and from what I know, he has been training with Mark Henry, which makes sense. They have a bunch of Russian fighters over there, like Zabit, and he's pretty impressive. I was able to watch. I did watch the PFL fights back in the day. Now, when I saw his name pop up on this card, it didn't immediately click with me that was one of the guys that I've seen previously fight. So when I was doing some research and pulled up some of his fights, it all kind of came back in my head. He's a good striker. He's got good grappling. The thing with Valiev, though, is I don't see a ton of finishing potential. If he can really... One of the things that he will do is he'll put pressure on you, and he's got some solid leg kicks. So I like to see that. The issue with Valiev in this fight against Emmers is there's a huge size disadvantage. Emmers has a very big size advantage here. He's 5'10", so he's 4 inches taller, and he has like a 6 or 7 inch reach advantage over Valiev. Valiev's moving up. He typically fights at bantamweight to fight Emmers at 145, and Emmers is already a big 145er. When I look at Jamal Emmers, I see a lot of potential because of his size, and he's pretty well rounded. He's a good fight. He's got some wrestling ability. solid striking. It's just, when it comes to Jamal Emmers, it's just fulfilling his potential. This is a guy that beat Cody Sandhagen, who is a highly ranked UFC fighter, just about 3 years ago. So we know that he's a game opponent. We just haven't seen it yet so far in the UFC, and who knows, maybe this will be his coming out, his coming out party this Saturday night. When I look at this matchup, I think Valiev is probably the more skilled fighter in just about every area. He's probably a little bit better of a striker, a little bit better of a grappler. I would say they're kind of dead even when it comes to wrestling. But when you're talking about a significant size disadvantage, how far does that skill and technique advantage that you have, how far does that get you in the fight when you're just that much smaller of a fighter? He's not going to be stronger than Emmers. If these guys strike and Emmers controls the distance, Valiev's going to have to come on the inside to land strikes, and then you're opening yourself up to potentially taking some pretty significant punches back. So when I look at the odds, Emmers is a slight underdog in this one. I believe he's around plus 135, plus 140. Valiev minus 155, and that line has swung a little bit. Valiev opened up as a bigger favorite. And if I were to put some cash on this fight, I would actually put it on Jamal Emmers. Even though I think Valiev is, as I mentioned, probably the more skilled and has better technique than Jamal Emmers when it comes to grappling and striking, I just think it's going to be very difficult for him to overcome that size advantage. I think this is a fight that goes the distance either way. Jamal Emmers, he's not the most powerful striker. He did have some knockouts. I mean, he fought for M1, he fought for LFA. He has some knockouts, has some finishes on his record, but he also has some submissions as well. So, again, well-rounded fighter, but I don't expect Valiev to be an easy out here. I think this one goes the distance, and I think what ends up happening is Emmers should be able to use his length to prevent takedowns. Maybe he'll secure a few takedowns, and then hopefully we'll be able to use his length to have a striking advantage. So I would give the nod to Emmers, and I think he's a solid guy to place a little bit of money on. When it comes to DraftKings, these guys' salaries are pretty close. You have Jamal Emmers coming in at 7,800 and Valiev at 8,400, I believe. Yes, 8,400. So you're talking that high 7, low 8 salary range where you're probably going to have some exposure to someone in that area. I really do like Jamal Emmers here because I think of all the fighters in that price range, he probably offers the most upside for a win. There's some other guys there like Ed Herman and Eric Spicely that might have more finishing potential, but I think that the likelihood of those guys winning in comparison to Jamal Emmers is less. So those are guys that you're looking for kind of finish or bust. With Jamal Emmers, though a finish is probably not likely, there's a good chance that he wins this fight, and that's why I think those odds have swung a little bit. Even though it's still in Valiev's favor, he's not as big of a favorite. In Jamal Emmers' previous UFC fight, it did go to decision against Chikadze. He put up 40 fantasy points, but that wasn't terrible. He lost that fight split decision. If he wins that fight, then you're talking 30 more points with DraftKings scoring format. You're looking at 70 points, which isn't horrible. You're always hoping for more than that, but it's not something that's going to ruin your card. So I like Jamal Emmers here. If he can score me 40, 50 points in a loss, and we've seen that can happen, then you're talking 70 to 80 points in a decision victory. And a finish would just be icing on the cake. So really like Jamal Emmers here. For Valiev, he's not a horrible option either because you have some really close fights in the low 8,000s with Bobby Green versus Lando Venata, Ed Herman versus Gerald Meerschaert. So if you're not confident in those fights, Valiev's not a bad guy to get in your lineup. I just don't think I will have too much exposure to him. Definitely have more exposure to Jamal Emmers. So we'll move on to the next fight, which is taking place in the middleweight division, and it's Marcus Perez versus Eric Spicely. Marcus Perez, 12-3 record. Pretty decent sized favorite here. If I pull up the odds, Perez is -200, taking on Eric Spicely, 12-5 record, who is a +165, +170, depending on your sports book. Marcus Perez, since he's been in the UFC, he's been kind of back and forth. In his last 5 fights, he's 2-3. He lost a decision to Eric Anders, pretty tough fight. He was able to sub James Bacinovic. He lost to Andrew Sanchez, another tough fight, and that was a decision. He subbed Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, Anaconda choke, and then in his most recent fight, he lost to Wellington Turman. That went to decision, that went the distance as well. On the flip side, Eric Spicely has really struggled in the UFC. In fact, he was bounced out of the UFC and they brought him back. Lost to Deron Wynn most recently, that was about a year ago. Had a few wins outside of the UFC, but his UFC track record just doesn't look good. He was knocked out by Gerald Mearshart. He was knocked out by Darren Stewart. He's just really struggled facing UFC competition. He also was choked out by Antonio Carlos Jr. So Eric Spicely, things were looking good for him when he first got into the UFC. I mean, he lost to Sam Alvey, but then he was able to turn around and finish Thiago Santos and Alessio Di Chirico. So he's on a pretty big losing skid here in the UFC, and I think that will continue. And the reason for that is because I think Marcus Perez is just a better fighter everywhere. The only thing that you have to worry about with Perez is he's a very wild and eccentric fighter, which does scare me against a submission artist like Eric Spicely, because if you put yourself in a bad position against Eric Spicely, you could get subbed. The thing is, though, Marcus Perez does have solid submission skills. So when I pull up Marcus Perez and I'm looking at his losses, all of his losses so far have come by decision. He hasn't been finished. That is not a good sign for a guy like Eric Spicely, who is not a high output grappler nor a high output striker. If he's going to win a UFC fight, he either needs to dominate the fight on the ground or submit you, and I don't see that happening against Marcus Perez. Marcus Perez will have a pretty significant striking advantage here, and I think he holds his own in jiu-jitsu. He has some submission victories himself, so I wouldn't be surprised if he either knocked out Eric Spicely in this fight or was able to submit him. I want to pull up some of the stats for this fight. When it comes to striking, Eric Spicely, 3.71 significant strikes per minute, 45% striking accuracy, 5.72 strikes absorbed. On the flip side, for Marcus Perez, 2.75 significant strikes landed per minute, 48% striking accuracy, 3.96 strikes absorbed. And if we just quickly go over the grappling, Spicely 1.31 takedowns per 15 minutes, 20% takedown accuracy, 75% takedown defense, which is pretty solid. And for Marcus Perez, 1.08 takedowns per 15 minutes, 26% takedown accuracy, 80% takedown defense. So their grappling numbers are pretty similar. I mean, if you look at this fight, their numbers match up, but Marcus Perez is just the better fighter. I mean, I've watched both of these guys fight, and I just don't ever feel comfortable, backing Eric Spicely in a fight until he gets you on the ground or is able to take control of your back. His striking is not pretty at all. His grappling is not pretty, which, makes sense when you have a 20% takedown accuracy. Not really a threat to take Marcus Perez down in this fight, and for that reason, I really lean Perez. As I mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if Perez was able to finish him and potentially finish him pretty early. Might be the last we see of Eric Spicely in the UFC. Moving on to the next fight, we have Ray Borg versus Nathan Maness in the featherweight division. So this fight is, are they fighting at bantamweight? Ray Borg's typically a bantamweight fighter. He has always been a 135 pounder, but he has floated. He actually fought at 125 for a while, and just couldn't make weight any longer. Really struggled. His most recent fight was against Ricky Simone. He lost that fight, split decision. He actually outstruck Ricky Simone in that fight, but he's being the smaller fighter, he couldn't prevent the takedowns, and Ricky Simone was able to just shoot in at will and get that fight to the ground. Before that, Ray Borg was able to win unanimous decision against Rogerio Bontorin. The fight before that, he was able to beat Gabriel Silva, lost to Casey Kenny by decision, and then of course he had his title fight against Demetrius Johnson where he lost via armbar, and he looked pretty good in that fight. The thing with Ray Borg is he's a really good fighter all around, especially when he has the ability to scramble. I think that's when Ray Borg is best. He's able to scramble. It might look like he's being taken down. He scrambles out. Now he's in an advantageous position. Might be able to catch you with some short uppercuts or strikes kind of in the clinch. That's where you're going to get the best out of Ray Borg. He doesn't have a ton of finishes. And as I've mentioned, his last 5 UFC fights, he's 2-3. But some tough competition in those fights, and he wasn't the most active fighter. Really because he was struggling with his weight. Nathan Maness, 11-1. He has fought for TKO and then some other organizations that I don't know too much about, but I do know that he has a bunch of finishes on his record. His most recent fight 5 months ago was against Kellen Van Camp, and he knocked him out. Kellen Van Camp 3-2, and that fight took place in HR MMA. Don't know anything about that organization. His only loss came to Taylor Lapalus, who I believe is a French fighter. Pretty solid prospect, guy with a 14-3 record. That was over in TKO. But before that, the guy was just unstoppable. He beat Jesse Arnett by knockout. Chao Machado, he won that fight by decision. And then he's got a few submission victories as well. So he's a guy that can finish fights, which is what I like to see for an underdog. Because when I check out the odds in this fight, Ray Borg is -235, Nathan Maness is +195. I actually give the edge to Nathan Maness in this fight, because the one thing that I've seen from Ray Borg is that he struggles when he's just outsized in a fight, and we saw that against Ricky Simone. And unfortunately, Nathan Maness is even bigger than Ricky Simone. He's going to have a 6-inch height advantage and like an 11-inch reach advantage. And Nathan Maness has a wrestling background. So, it's not like you can even give... I don't know. I wouldn't say that Nathan Maness is the better wrestler than Ray Borg, but he's certainly... Ray Borg he isn't that much better of a wrestler than Nathan Maness. So, based on that information, what is Ray Borg's path to victory here? Is he going to be able to take Nathan Maness down? And if not, then is he going to be able to outstrike him when he's going to have such a disadvantage from a reach perspective? And we kind of talked about this with Jamal Emmers and Timur Valiev, but here it's even magnified more. So if I'm going to bet on this fight, I really like Nathan Maness at +195. And when you're looking at this fight from a DFS perspective, I love Nathan Maness here as well. At 7,200, he's one of the cheapest fighters on the slate, and he's a guy with a legitimate path to victory. And he's a guy that has shown finishing potential throughout his professional career. So this is a guy that you can get in your lineup, pay very little for, and potentially end up with a bunch of points. For Ray Borg, at that 9,000 price point, he's the third most expensive fighter. I'm just staying away from him. If Borg doesn't get a finish, he doesn't put up a ton of points. 29 points against Ricky Simone. When he lost to Kenny, 58 points. His loss to DJ, 25. His win against Formiga, that went the distance, 56 points. So really, the Bontarone fight is the one outlier where that fight went the distance and he was able to put up 116 fantasy points. And the reason for that was because he was able to secure 10 takedowns. I don't see him securing 10 takedowns against Nathan Maness. I don't know if he'll even be able to secure one takedown. And he's not a high volume striker. He's a solid striker. He has good technique, but he just doesn't throw with a ton of volume. When I look at his last couple fights here, 47 significant strikes, 35 significant strikes, 15 significant strikes, 17 significant strikes, 13 significant strikes. So, with Ray Borg, it's takedown / finish or bust, and he's just a guy that doesn't have a ton of finishes in the UFC. So you really need to hope that he has a significant grappling advantage in order for him to pay up for that $9,000 price point. I don't see that here. So I'm staying away from Ray Borg, but I will have a lot of exposure to Nathan Maness. All right, so the next fight here is taking place in the light heavyweight division, and it's Ed Herman versus Gerald Meerschaert. Both of these guys are veterans in the UFC. Ed Herman's been around forever. The 39-year-old has a professional record of 24-14, but he's on a nice little two-fight win streak here. He was able to knock out Patrick Cummins, and then he also beat Khadis Ibragimov by decision in his most recent fight 8 months ago. We've talked about Ibragimov. I think the guy stinks. And he proved that when Daleeds Day knocked him out a few weeks ago. So I do not expect Ibragimov to be in the UFC much longer. On the flip side, Gerald Meerschaert coming off of a pretty vicious loss when he was knocked out, that overhand to the right by Ian Heinisch. And that was just about a month ago. Before that, he did have a submission win against Deron Winn, for what it's worth. I don't think Deron Winn is of UFC talent. Had a split decision loss to Eric Anders, and he was able to sub Trevin Giles. So I think you can kind of see here Gerald Meerschaert's path to victory, and especially a guy that typically fights at middleweight. That's that 185-pound division. He's now moving up to fight Ed Herman. Even though these guys are basically the same size, I believe they're the same height, and Meerschaert actually has a reach advantage. Ed Herman's the more thicker and stockier fighter. I'm interested to see how Meerschaert looks as a light heavyweight. But Meerschaert's path to victory here is to get the fight to the ground and to submit you. The last time, I'm just going to pull up some of his resume here. The last time that, he beat Eric Spicely with a body kick back in 2017. Most of his victories, though, rear naked choke, guillotine choke, rear naked choke, arm bar, anaconda choke, arm triangle choke, Kimura. So you can see what Meerschaert's trying to accomplish here. He wants to get you to the ground and sub you. For Ed Herman, it was looking for a while there that he would not be a UFC fighter anymore. Dating back to 2016, he was knocked out by Derek Brunson, head kicked by Nikita Krylov, lost some close fights to CB Dalloway and John Vellante, who aren't great fighters. But the UFC booked him again, and he had that finish over Patrick Cummins and that unanimous decision victory against Ibragimov. So it's good for Ed Herman as a guy who's been around, I think, since Ultimate Fighter Season 2. The thing with Herman here is, when I look at his losses in the UFC, he's only been subbed a few times. He was subbed by Jacare back in 2013. That wasn't even in the UFC. That was in Strikeforce. He was also subbed by Damian Maia. So you're talking two of the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu submission artists in the world to ever grace the octagon. Before that, you'd have to go all the way back to 2006 when he lost triangle choke to Jason McDonald. So, really, this is a fight where I'm surprised the odds aren't a little bit closer. Gerald Meerschaert's -175, Ed Herman's +155. I think the reason for that is Meerschaert probably has more finishing potential with his submission skills, and he's the much younger fighter. The thing is, though, both of these guys, well, more so Mearshardt's shown that he's been a little bit chinny in the UFC recently. And Ed Herman doesn't have a ton of finishes. You have to go back to his fight against Patrick Cummins to see a finish, but what I find interesting really when it comes to betting is the over-under in this fight, because it's 1.5. And, most of the fights on this card are 2.5, so Vegas is expecting a lot of these fights to go the distance. With this Ed Herman, Gerald Mearshart, if you're looking at under 1.5 rounds, so a finish in the first round, it's only plus 155. Over 1.5 is minus 185. So this is a fight that you probably want to get some exposure to in DFS, which we will talk about. But just from a betting perspective, I'm not comfortable betting this fight really either way. Gerald Mearshart, minus 175, I have no interest in. Ed Herman, plus 155 is not bad. But again, I just don't have any faith or confidence in him. All right, so if I pull up the stats for this fight, we'll start with the striking, and it's pretty even. 3.33 significant strikes landed per minute for Ed Herman, with a 49% striking accuracy, and 3.13 strikes absorbed per minute. For Gerald Mearshart, 3.31 strikes landed per minute, 42% striking accuracy, and 3.58 strikes absorbed per minute. In the grappling department, these guys are pretty even as well. 2.2 takedowns for 15 minutes. Ed Herman, 48% takedown accuracy, 59% takedown defense. For Mearshart, 2.34 takedowns per 15 minutes, 43% takedown accuracy, 46% takedown defense. Look, Ed Herman's a big boy. I don't think Mearshart is used to fighting guys with the size of Ed Herman, and he's really good in the clinch. I think Mearshart has trouble taking down Ed Herman in this fight. And if he can't get the fight to the ground, he's going to have a pretty tough time finishing him via submission. So, I lean Ed Herman in this fight, believe it or not. Again, not a fight that I really want to bet on, and nor is it a fight that I want to have too much exposure to in DFS, but, at the price point that these fighters are, $8,300 for Mearshart, $7,900 for Ed Herman, I might end up having a little bit exposure. And I probably will end up having a little bit exposure of this fight both ways, similar to Paul Craig and Antigulov last week. I didn't really love that fight. I thought it would be sloppy. I favored Antigulov, but it was a fight that, there was a good chance that it would be finished. Both of those guys had a ton of finishes and had been finished in the first round. In this fight, I feel like you might need some exposure. And if you have a guy like Gerald Mearshart or Ed Herman in your lineup and they get a finish, because we've seen Mearshart be finished in the UFC pretty recently, as of late, just a month ago when he was knocked out by Heinisch, then you're looking to be in a good spot in these GPP tournaments. So I would lean Ed Herman, not going to bet it, not going to have a ton of exposure in DFS, maybe just a little bit of Herman, a little bit of Mearshart sprinkled in. All right, so we'll move on to the next fight on the card here, which is in the bantamweight division, Frankie Saenz versus Jonathan Martinez. Frankie Saenz, 12-6 record, going up against Jonathan Martinez, who's 11-3, coming off of a controversial loss in his most recent fight to Andre Ewell. It was a split decision loss, but a lot of people thought Jonathan Martinez won the fight. If you look in the media, all over Twitter, they would tell you that, hey, Jonathan Martinez won that fight. But either way, he took a loss, which is a shame because he's now 2-2 in his UFC career. He's got 2 wins against Asian, or even more specifically, Chinese fighters in Weiliji Burin and Ping Yuan Liu, who he knocked out about a year ago, and he looked really impressive in that fight. Of course, he lost his UFC debut to Andrei Sukumtov, and that was a unanimous decision. It's going to be tough. Your UFC debut is always tough. For Frankie Saenz, we haven't seen him fight in a while. It's been a year and a half since he fought Marlon Vera, and Marlon Vera knocked him out, I believe, with like a left hook pretty early in that fight. Before that, Saenz had some wins. He beat Henry Briones, unanimous decision. Briones, I don't even believe, is in the UFC any longer. And then he beat Merab Valashvili. And that was almost 3 years ago. And I believe that was Valashvili's UFC debut. So Frankie Saenz, the problem with him here is he's 39 years old now. He hasn't been an active fighter, and he's going to be the shorter fighter. He will have less reach in this fight. So, when I'm looking at this fight, it just starts to add up even more and more to me that Jonathan Martinez has an advantage in this fight. I don't see Frankie Saenz having the ability to finish Jonathan Martinez. And when I look at Frankie Saenz, his most recent victories, decision. So the guy's a decision merchant, not anyone that I want in my DFS lineup. And for Jonathan Martinez, Martinez does have some finishing ability. We've seen him armbar some fighters over in Combate. He was able to TKO Ping Yuan Liu, so he definitely has more finishing ability than Frankie Saenz, which makes sense because he is a favorite in this fight. Martinez is minus 250. Frankie Saenz is plus 210, and I don't believe it opened that way. I believe Martinez opened somewhere as like a minus 200 favorite. So things have really swung in his favor, and it totally makes sense. If I'm a betting man, I'm putting some money on Jonathan Martinez in this fight. Just don't have faith in a guy that hasn't fought in a long time, is the smaller fighter and the much older fighter as well. 13-year difference in age. When we look at the stats in this fight, I just want to pull them up. Significant strikes, and again, these guys are really even. 3.97 significant strikes landed per minute for Frankie Saenz with a 46% striking accuracy. 3.67 for Jonathan Martinez with a 47% striking accuracy. Frankie Saenz does have a grappling advantage. 1.7 takedowns per 15 minutes, 32% takedown accuracy, 62% takedown defense. For Jonathan Martinez, just 0.51 takedowns per 15 minutes, 28% takedown accuracy, and then this number is a little startling, 33% takedown defense. It's not good. So, it's possible Saenz could take him down and grind out a victory, but the thing is, Saenz doesn't have great takedown accuracy. 32% is not a it's about an average number. And when you're talking about fighting a guy that has a size advantage, it might be difficult for Saenz to get this to the mat. If Saenz's path to victory is to getting this to the mat and grinding out the fight, but Saenz isn't a guy that's going to shoot for a bunch of submissions and finish you with submissions either. So, just not really feeling Frankie Saenz this weekend. Jonathan Martinez, he wants to keep this fight standing, take advantage of his reach, and hopefully he'll be able to finish Frankie Saenz here in this fight. He is a southpaw fighter as well, so it's another thing to think about. When we're looking at this fight on DraftKings, Jonathan Martinez, 8,600. That's a solid price because a lot of the other fighters in that area, we've talked about Valiev at 8,400. You have Jojo Calderwood, who we'll talk about, at 8,700. Meerschaert, 8,300. Marcus Perez, who I really like, 8,500. So, you're going to have exposure to one of those guys. This isn't a card like last weekend where you have a bunch of guys 9,000 plus. You got closer matchups this weekend, so a lot of guys in the high eights. I think that I will have some exposure to Jonathan Martinez. Now, he hasn't put up a ton of fantasy points in the UFC thus far. 44 points against Sukumtov in a loss that went the distance. 76 against Buren, that went the distance. 71 to Ping Yuan, who he did TKO, but the TKO took place in the third round. Then his most recent fight against Ewell, only 33 fantasy points. But the good thing about this is we're not seeing Jonathan Martinez get finished, right? So even in his losses, he's still putting up 35, 45 points. Victories, we're seeing about 70 to 75 points, which isn't bad. And hopefully we can get an early finish out of him, and he'll really pay up to that 8,600 price point. And this is where I talked about probably having exposure to a guy like Meerschaert or Ed Herman, because they probably have more finishing potential, even though that's a much closer fight, and it's really a wild card. It's, best guess when you're selecting one of those guys. So depending on how you play, if you're playing cash or if you're playing tournament, that should give you a little bit more information as to how you should approach these fighters that are in the mid 8,000s. I will have Jonathan Martinez in my ideal lineup because I do think that he has a very good chance of winning this fight. And, if he puts up 60, 70 significant strikes, you're talking about 75, 80 points, which is pretty solid. And then, like I said, there's always finishing potential because we just saw it 2 fights ago. For Frankie Saenz, he's not someone that I would fade completely because he's cheap at 7,600. But I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to him. I don't plan on having a ton of exposure to him. You could do worse at 7,600. There's guys like Randy Brown and Derek Brunson that I am completely fading this week. So if you're trying to diversify your lineup, you can get Frankie Saenz in your lineup because I do expect this fight to go the distance. And in fights that go the distance, he can still put up anywhere from 30 to 40 points in a loss. If he wins, then you're talking 75, 70 points, very similar to Jonathan Martinez. So, you can get Frankie Saenz in your lineup, but I will be paying up for Jonathan Martinez. All right, so we're moving on to the main card here in the middleweight division. Kevin Holland versus Trevin Giles. Kevin Holland, 17-5 record, taking this fight on short notice versus Trevin Giles with a 12-2 record. Kevin Holland is a UFC veteran at this point. He is 4-1 in his last 5 UFC fights. He's got finishes over Anthony Fernandez and John Phillips. And then he also has a few victories over Gerald Meerschaert and Alessio Di Chirico. His only loss in his most recent 5 fights in the UFC here was against Brendan Allen. He was subbed in that fight. Brendan Allen's looked like a monster so far in the UFC. For Trevin Giles, he's coming off of a split decision victory over James Krause. Now, James Krause took that fight on short notice and moved up a weight class to fight Trevin Giles, and it was a pretty close back and forth striking match. Before that, he lost to Gerald Meerschaert, so they have a common opponent there. He was subbed, guillotine choke. He was also subbed by Zach Cummings. And then he had 2 knockout wins early on in his UFC career versus James Bocnovich and Antonio Braga Neto. So 2 young fighters. They're both 27 years old, but they have some legitimate UFC experience. And if I look at the betting odds in this fight, just to point them out real quickly, Trevin Giles is plus 175, Kevin Holland is minus 210. And that does make sense to me because Kevin Holland has a size advantage. I guess you could say that. He's the taller, more rangy fighter. Trevin Giles is a little bit more stocky than Kevin Holland. But the thing is Trevin Giles, we have seen that he is susceptible to being submitted, and you just saw my dog walk in the background there. And that's not good when you're going up against Kevin Holland, who has some pretty slick submission skills if the fight goes to the ground. Now, as I mentioned, Kevin Holland is taking this fight on short notice, and he's still a pretty sizable favorite in this fight. That just shows you how Vegas views this one going down. I think there's a clear path to victory for Kevin Holland here. That clear path to victory is to get this fight to the ground and submit Trevin Giles. Pretty simple. For Trevin Giles, he needs to keep this fight standing. Or, he can mix it up. He can make it a dirty fight, get in the clinch as well. And if you're backing Trevin Giles here, you want to make sure that, or what you want to see is Trevin Giles land some pretty big shots. It's possible, but I don't know if it's likely. I know James Krause is a seasoned vet, but he took that fight on like something crazy, like 3 days short notice, much smaller fighter, and Trevin Giles wasn't able to put him away. I want to pull up some of their stats here. So we'll look at Kevin Holland first. 4.29 significant strikes landed per minute, 55% striking accuracy, 2.56 strikes absorbed. And on the flip side for Trevin Giles, 3.61 significant strikes landed per minute, 56% striking accuracy, 1.75 strikes absorbed. So they're pretty even in the striking area department. The grappling side of things, takedowns, 1.26 per 15 minutes for Kevin Holland, 43% takedown accuracy, 48% takedown defense. For Trevin Giles, 1.47 takedown average per 15 minutes, 100% takedown accuracy, which is interesting because it's not a big part of his game, and 73% takedown defense. So Trevin Giles has a grappling advantage, but where you're going to see that difference is when it comes to submissions. Kevin Holland's pulling off 1.1 submissions per 15 minutes. Trevin Giles 0.2, so we're not really seeing much from him when it comes to his jiu-jitsu. This is a fight that I could honestly see go either way. I would not be comfortable betting Kevin Holland minus 210, taking this fight on short notice. Now, from what I know, Kevin Holland had a fight scheduled a little bit earlier, on a more recent UFC card, but his opponents had to back out. So it's not like this guy hasn't had a training camp, but he hasn't had a full training camp to focus on this opponent, Trevin Giles. Giles at plus 175 makes a little bit of sense to me. I don't know if I expect him to win this fight, just because I do think these guys are pretty evenly matched. But Kevin Holland has definitely looked more impressive and has fought tougher competition thus far in the UFC. Like I said, they have those common opponent in Gerald Meerschaert, and Holland was able to come out as a victor in that fight, whereas Trevin Giles was subbed. So if I'm looking at this from a betting perspective, I'm probably staying away. It's a difficult one to bet when you have Kevin Holland taking this fight on short notice. I think the odds should be closer than they really are. I think that's the one kind of startling thing about this fight, and we're seeing that over on DraftKings as well, in DFS. Trevin Giles is 7,300. I think that's solid value for him there. Talked a little bit about Cody Durden and how he could be kind of a sleeper dart throw in your lineup. I think Trevin Giles kind of fits in the same category there, though he will probably have higher ownership than Cody Durden. For Kevin Holland, you're going to have to pay a premium for him, 8,900. I don't know if I love that regarding the circumstances. Kevin Holland is definitely a fighter that has more output. So when I look at his most recent scores in fantasy, they're pretty solid outside of that loss to Brendan Allen. I mean, in his most recent fight against Anthony Hernandez, who hasn't really had any success in the UFC, he just dominated him really early in that fight. Just came at him with some significant volume and pressure, and it only took him 14 strikes to knock out Anthony Hernandez. But even before that, against Meerschaert, 71 points, Phillips 156 points. Don't expect that in this fight. I mean, he took down John Phillips, who probably has the worst takedown defense in all of MMA, 5 times. So had a bunch of takedowns and advances, which is why that number was so high. For Trevin Giles, if I look at his most recent fantasy performances, 80 points against Krause, 29 against Meerschaert, 16 against Cummings, 19 against Neto, 134 against Bojanovic. And, you know, if the fight stays standing, we're seeing a decent amount of volume and output from Trevin Giles. And I saw an interview with Trevin Giles, and he actually didn't mind the change in opponent because he expects this fight to be just more exciting all around. So Trevin Giles is a guy that I like at that 7,300 price point. I would expect to have some exposure to him, probably not too much exposure to Kevin Holland. I don't know if Trevin Giles will be in my ideal lineup. We'll talk about that, though, when we get to the end of this segment. That's the money-making segment. So I lean, probably, if I was, gun to my head, I think Kevin Holland wins this fight, but I would certainly not bet it. And he's not a guy that I want to or feel comfortable paying $8,900 for. So take it with a grain of salt, man. If you're going to play this from a DFS perspective or even from a betting perspective, I would lean Trevin Giles. Moving on to the next fight on the main card, and this should be an exciting one. In the lightweight division, we have Bobby Green versus Lando Vannata, and we know how this fight's going to go down. We're going to see a lot of creative striking. You have Bobby Green, who is pretty much a pure boxer, very similar styles to Nate and Nick Diaz. He trains with them, so it makes sense. Lando Groovy Vannata, we've seen him in action now in the UFC, and he's just had some spectacular kick techniques and knockouts and stuff like that. But recently, for Vannata, a lot of his fights have gone the distance. I'm just looking at his most recent 5 fights. 2 years ago, Drakkar Klose, he lost that fight. That went to decision. There was a majority draw decision against Matt Frivola. He did sub Marcos Mariano. I don't even know how that guy was in the UFC. That was a short notice fight, and that was an expected victory for Vannata. And then his two most recent fights, he lost to Mark Jacasey. That was, again, went the distance. And then 5 months ago, he went the distance with Yancy Medeiros, won that fight. Bobby Green, we saw him just a month ago against Clay Guida, where he won that fight via unanimous decision, but in all honesty, he didn't look very impressive. And the 2 fights before that, he lost to Francisco Trinaldo, that went the distance. Drakkar Klose also went the distance, so again, common opponent there. They both lost to Drakkar Klose. So far throughout Bobby Green's career in the UFC, or at least recently, his fights tend to go the distance, and it makes sense because he doesn't have a ton of power. He can put you out, but his style of fighting is just more of that boxing style of fighting where he's going to rely on that jab. He's not going to swing crazy hooks. And we've seen that with Vannata as well. When I look at the odds in this fight, Lando Vannata is minus 150, Bobby Green is plus 130. I think when it comes to pure striking, and that's where I see where this fight will probably be for all 15 minutes, I think Vannata definitely has that advantage. So those odds make sense to me. And if I were to bet on this fight, I would be betting on Lando Vannata. I want to pull up some of the stats, though. We'll take a look at Lando Vannata first. 4.72 strikes landed per minute, 44% striking accuracy, 4.73 strikes absorbed. For Bobby Green, the numbers are similar. 5 strikes landed per minute, 49% accuracy, 3.52 strikes absorbed. When it comes to grappling, these guys are dead even there as well. They're both averaging a little bit over 1 takedown per 15 minutes. Vannata's got a little bit of an advantage in takedown accuracy with 36% to Bobby Green's 31%. Takedown defense, Vannata 64%, Bobby Green 74%. But we saw Bobby Green was taken down a few times by Clay Guida in his most recent fight. When it comes to size, these guys have an identical reach and they're basically the same height. So, I mean, this is about as even as a fight as you're going to get on this card, which is why the odds are the way they are. I lean Vannata. When it comes to DFS, I'm going to stay away from this fight because I don't see a ton of potential for a finish here. Bobby Green's not easy to finish, and Vannata's got a pretty strong chin too. These guys are, it's your 8,200, $8,000 salary price range. So these guys are super close in price as well over on DK, DraftKings. Bobby Green, 83 points against Guida, 47 against Trinaldo, 66 against Close, 101 against Eric Koch. I mean, and he fought Lando Venata. I forgot about that. I can't believe I didn't mention it. He fought Venata back in 2017, and that fight was a draw, and he had 52 points. So, these guys have fought each other, and it went the distance, and I expect the same to occur here. For Venata, in his most recent performances, 80 against Medeiros, 30 against Jacasey, 111 against Mariano, that's that outlier, 59 against Frivola, 33 against Closa, and 85 back in 2017 when he fought Bobby Green previously. I think that I don't plan on having a ton of exposure to these guys, but this is a fight where if you're playing in some GPPs, you can have exposure to both of them and not feel too bad about it, because it's going to be a back and forth striking match, and both these guys are high output fighters, so I do expect them to put up numbers whether or not they win or lose the fight. So I mean, if you pay 8,200 and Venata wins the fight, you're looking at anywhere from 75 to 85 fantasy points if it goes the distance. If he loses, then you're down to like 55, 50, 60 points, not going to kill you. And it's really the same for Bobby Green. So, I like maybe having some lineups that are similar where you just sub out Bobby Green for Venata or sub out Venata for Bobby Green. That way you're getting those extra 30 points that matter a lot in tournaments. But for me, neither of these guys will be in my ideal lineup, which is a shame because I am really looking forward to this rematch. So we'll move on to the next fight, which is taking place in the welterweight division. Vicente Luque versus Randy Brown. I've always been a big Vicente Luque fan. Vicente Luque, 18-7 record. Randy Brown, 12-3. Luque's won 4 of his last 5 UFC fights. Randy Brown's won 3 of his last 5 UFC fights. I want to just take a peek at some of those opponents. Luque knocked out Barberena. He knocked out Derek Krantz. He had that split decision victory against Mike Perry. That was really close back and forth, but he landed some big elbows and broke Mike Perry's nose. Took a loss to Wonderboy Thompson. I mean, you can't fault him too much for that. And then in his most recent fight, he knocked out Nico Price. I think that was by stoppage. Price's eye just blew up. So that was a good fight. He was landing some big shots on Price there. These guys do have some common opponents, by the way, which we'll touch on. Randy Brown has a submission triangle choke victory over Worley Alves in his most recent fight. He also knocked out Brian Barberena. He lost to Nico Price. Has a victory over Mickey Gall, who stinks, so take that for what it is. And he lost to Bilal Muhammad. Both of these guys have fought some legitimate competition in the UFC, and I think that's why the odds are the way that they are, with Luque being minus 175, Randy Brown being plus 155. It's not like either, Luque's not a huge favorite in this fight, but I think he should have no problem against Randy Brown here. Randy Brown does have a size advantage. He is 6'3", Luque's 5'11", so he's a little bit taller, but the reach is basically the same. Brown's got a couple inches in reach when it comes to that advantage, but he's not the same striker that Luque is. Luque is a much more polished striker and hits with much more power. So I really like Luque here, minus 175. I think that's something that I feel pretty comfortable laying some decent cash on. I want to pull up some of the stats for this fight as well. Luque averaging 5.66 significant strikes landed per minute, 53% striking accuracy, but 5.79 strikes absorbed. On the other side of things, Randy Brown, 3.41 strikes landed per minute, 47% striking accuracy, 2.42 strikes absorbed per minute. Like I said, Vicente Luque is the better striker. I guess the only concern here is because Brown is a little bit longer, more rangy fighter. Is Luque going to have trouble closing the distance and getting on the inside? But the way Randy Brown strikes, he's not a wonder boy. He's not an elite striker in the UFC, so I'm not too concerned about that. Their grappling stats are pretty even, and I don't expect this fight to really turn into a grappling match unless for some reason Randy Brown catches Luque and then wants to take him down to the mat. Both of them average less than a takedown per 15 minutes. Their takedown accuracy hovers right around 50%, and their takedown defense, Luque's at 65%, Randy Brown is at 71%. So I expect this fight to mostly be a striking match, and I think Luque has a good chance of knocking out or TKOing Randy Brown here. If I were to bet on this fight, that's probably where I would put my cash. I would say Luque by finish. When it comes to DraftKings, Luque is 8,800, so he's pretty pricey. But again, he averages 92 fantasy points per fight, so 120 against Nico Price. He had the one stinker, 39 against Wonderboy, 72 against Perry, 109 against Krantz, 145 against Barberena. So, I mean, this is a guy that's going to fight with a ton of output. I mean, it's not difficult for him to reach that 100 significant strike mark. And if he doesn't reach it, that usually means that he finished his opponent. For Randy Brown, let's just look at his stats real quick. Randy Brown, 7,400. Really, that's not... You know, I think Randy Brown's going to have some ownership. I think people are going to see the fantasy point per fight potential that he has. 91 against Alves, 100 versus Barberena, 106 versus Camozzi. I mean, they're going to see those big numbers and they're like, wow, this is a guy that I can get at 7,400. Maybe he's a guy I should slot into my lineup, but I don't see it here. I think Luque finishes him. I'd much rather have Trevin Giles in my lineup that you can get right around the same price point, just because I think there's greater likelihood that he actually wins the fight than Randy Brown. So, yeah, really like Luque here. Lock him into your lineup. We'll move on to the next fight, which is the co-main event. Joanne Calderwood versus Jennifer Maia. This fight's taking place in the flyweight division, which of course is 125 pounds. And, you know, Calderwood, 14-4 record. She's been in the UFC for a while now. Really solid. Jennifer Maia, she's now a veteran at this point as well. She's had 4 UFC fights, 2-2 in the UFC, with a professional record of 17-6-1. She lost her UFC debut to Liz Carmouche, just out-grappled in that one. She had 2 victories against Alexis Davis and Roxanne Modafferi, which were pretty impressive, but she lost her most recent fight to Caitlin Chookagian, which is why I think Joanne Calderwood is going to have an advantage in this fight. She beat Andrea Lee. That was a split decision victory in her most recent fight. She also lost to Caitlin Chookagian, so they have that common opponent. She's beaten Ariane Lipsky. She was able to sub Kalindra Faria. That was by triangle. And she also has she went the distance with Cynthia Calvillo and lost that fight. Cynthia Calvillo, though, is bigger opponent. She's now fighting at 135. Vegas seems to favor JoJo Calderwood as well. She's minus 150. Jennifer Maia is plus 130 as it stands. So the odds have shifted a little bit there. Calderwood opened up as a larger favorite. I think this is pretty evident in this fight. Calderwood has an advantage when it comes to striking, and Jennifer Maia has an advantage when it comes to grappling. The other thing that you have to think about here is Jennifer Maia has had trouble making weight in the UFC. Like in her most recent fight against Chookagian, she looked awful on the scales. So definitely pay attention to that. If you have a chance to check in the weigh-ins, take a look at Jennifer Maia, because if she is in that condition again, that'll certainly have implications on the fight against Calderwood, who, you know, Jennifer Maia could gas out and Calderwood could take an advantage of that. I want to pull up some stats here. For striking, Calderwood 6.19 significant strikes landed per minute, 47% striking accuracy, 4.31 strikes absorbed. For Jennifer Maia, 4.05 strikes landed per minute, 38% striking accuracy, 3.78 strikes absorbed. When it comes to grappling, Calderwood does average more takedowns. She's close to 2 per 15 minutes, 56% takedown accuracy, 55% takedown defense. Maia only 0.25 takedowns on average per 15 minutes, but if you look at those opponents, Chookagian, size advantage. Roxanne Modafferi, really good grappler. Alexis Davis, really good grappler. Liz Carmouche, really good grappler. She's fought nothing but good grapplers in the UFC. So, that .25, I don't know how significant that number is. The numbers that are significant, though, is when she shot for takedowns, she's getting them at a 50% clip, and her takedown defense is solid, especially fighting good grapplers at 75%. So I think Maia has the grappling edge in this fight. Calderwood has the striking advantage in this fight. I like Calderwood to win this fight, though. She's just beaten tougher opponents, in my opinion, than Maia, and she's just has more experience against tough opponents. They both fought Shahbazyan, but Calderwood's had fights against Cynthia Calvillo, super slick jiu-jitsu skills, and not a bad striker either. This is a fight I expect to go the distance here, and if I had to bet money with that line coming down, Calderwood looks pretty juicy at -150. This is a fight I expect to go the distance, so and the odds for that aren't great. Over 2.5 rounds, -370, but I think that's what we're going to ultimately see. As far as DFS goes, I will not have any Jennifer Maia ownership, but she's not horrible at the 7,500 price point. This is going to be an interesting slate. Let me tell you that, because there are some fighters in the 7,000s, mid to low 7,000s, that are going to inevitably pull off some upsets and win, and that's going to have a big impact on these GPPs. For Calderwood at 8,700, it's not bad to have her in your lineup, because even though she is a decision merchant, she will throw a lot of strikes, man. 101 significant strikes against Andrea Lee, 112 against Chookagian, and she lost that fight. 85 against Lipsky. So, I mean, you're talking in fights that she wins 90, 95 fantasy points, which is really what you're looking for, especially from a female fighter. For Jennifer Maia, on the flip side, we're not seeing the same amount of output, and that's why I think she loses this fight by decision. I just don't think she'll be able to keep up with Joanne Calderwood. 37 fantasy points against Chookagian, 72 against Modafferi, 60 against Davis, 21 against Carmouche. So you don't have a ton of scoring potential for Maia, which is why she's priced down at 7,500. But if she gets a victory, she could score anywhere from 60 to 70 points, which is okay. Like, if you're playing cash, you definitely feel a little bit safer having Jennifer Maia in your lineup than you do if you're playing in a tournament. I'll probably have a little bit of exposure to Calderwood. I don't expect to have too much exposure to Jennifer Maia, though, just because I don't see her, if this fight stays standing, outstriking Calderwood. And if this fight goes to the distance, which not only myself but Vegas expects, then you're going to give the nod, and the judges are going to give the nod to Calderwood. So yeah, you can have a little bit of exposure to Calderwood. I think she's a better option than probably Kevin Holland. Where you're going to have to weigh out your options is, do you pay $8,700 for Calderwood, or do you pay $8,600 for Jonathan Martinez? That's what it comes down to for me when I'm looking at grabbing a fighter in the high 8s, because I don't love Kevin Holland and I don't really love Ray Borg here. So, it's a decision you'll have to make, and I'll probably have some lineups that have a mixture of either Jonathan Martinez or Joanne Calderwood. All right, so moving on to the main event here. We have Derek Brunson versus Edmund Shahbazyan. That fight's taking place in the middleweight division. Brunson's got a record of 20-7, Shahbazyan 11-0. The Golden Boy, he's looked super impressive since he's been in the UFC. Had a really impressive victory in the Contender Series. 4 UFC victories so far. Darren Stewart, he's got a decision victory over him. Knocked out Charles Byrd. Subbed Jack Marshman, and then most recently knocked out Brad Tavares. This will be a step up in competition for him. Derek Brunson's won 3 of his last 5 UFC fights. At this point in his career, 36 years old, He's one of those gatekeepers. So this is your, prototypical gatekeeper versus young upcoming prospect. And I talked about that last card with Carla Esparza versus Rodriguez, even though Rodriguez was actually older than her. But you always have to be cautious about these matchups, because usually it's those young guns that are really taking a step up in competition here. Brunson beat Ian Heinisch, unanimous decision. Wasn't a ton of output in that fight. It was pretty boring. He also beat Elias Teodoro, another one. Thank goodness Elias Teodoro is no longer in the UFC. That guy's striking was absolutely horrible. And then he had two pretty rough losses there, back-to-back to Adesanya. He was knocked out. He was also knocked out by Jacare. But, you're talking two of the top 5 guys in the division. And obviously Adesanya is now the champ. And then about 3 years ago, he did knock out Lyoto Machida, which, Machida's no longer in the UFC. He's an older guy, so that wasn't too surprising. Brunson still has knockout power, man. And if he lands one on your chin, you could go to sleep. Problem here is I don't see that happening. Edmund Shahbazyan is just a complete monster, man. He just puts on so much pressure, and he's a big guy. I think Brunson's got a tough matchup here, a super tough matchup. And Vegas agrees with me. Looking at the odds, Shahbazyan is minus 310. Brunson is plus 255. I really like Shahbazyan here. And, minus 310, those odds suck. But I think Shahbazyan finishes Brunson. I think it happens early, probably in the first round. So if I am going to bet on this fight, give me the under 1.5 rounds, minus 130. That's where you're going to make your money on this fight. Let's look at some stats here. Derek Brunson, 3.39 significant strikes landed per minute, 45% striking accuracy, 2.91 strikes absorbed. For Shahbazyan, 4.11 significant strikes landed per minute, 52% striking accuracy, 2.16 strikes absorbed. And then grappling, that's where we're going to see a pretty big advantage for Shahbazyan. 6.77 takedowns per 15 minutes to Brunson's 2.8. Takedown accuracy, 40% for Shahbazyan, 29% for Brunson. And then this is the crazy stat, though. Derek Brunson, 100% takedown defense. Makes some sense because he does have some wrestling background. Shahbazyan, 75% takedown defense. So I will say this. When you look at those takedown defense numbers, it's interesting because what we've seen from Shahbazyan is he likes to land some strikes, take you to the ground, and then ground and pound you. But if he can't get Brunson to the ground, then that'll definitely throw a wrench into his game plan. But the thing is, I just think he's a better overall fighter. And it's not difficult to take a stunned fighter to the ground. And I think that could potentially happen, man. I think Shahbazyan could really do some damage here on Brunson. Either finish him standing, knock him out cold, or get Brunson on the mat after a knockdown and then just finish him off with some strikes on the ground, or even potentially sub him. He's got a nice rear naked choke. Looking at this fight from a DFS perspective, Shahbazyan's 9,100. He's the second most expensive fighter on the slate. Makes sense, man. 117 fantasy points, 108 fantasy points, 107 fantasy points, 90 fantasy points. This guy's a beast. And when I watched him knock out Charles Byrd, that was a big moment for me where I realized, like, this kid's got something special. I mean, he looked great in the Contender Series, but his first fight against Darren Stewart, his striking just didn't seem up to par, and he really relied on his grappling and takedowns in that fight. But since that fight against Byrd and Tavares and Marshman, his striking looks much more polished, which is interesting to me because he does train with Edmund Tarvarian, who I don't think is a very good coach. But nonetheless, Shahbazyan is someone that I want in my lineups. He is, at 9,100, and he's one of 3 fighters in the 9,000 price point. He's by far the most attractive option there because of his finishing potential. I expect him to be super high owned. On the flip side, Brunson is the second cheapest fighter at 7,100, and he'll get some ownership because in fights that he wins, Heinisch, he had 84 points, 93 points against Teodoro, and those weren't pretty striking matches. I'm actually surprised to see 81 significant strikes against Heinisch. But, when he lost to Adesanya and lost to Jacare, 2 fantasy points, 4 fantasy points. So, what Derek Brunson are we going to get? Really is what it comes down to. If he stuffs the takedowns and is able to use his reach advantage and land some significant strikes, he could be golden at that 7,100 price point. I just don't see it happening, man. I think Shahbazyan finishes him early. We're going to see a passing of the guard here. So probably won't have too much exposure to Brunson, but I will have a decent amount of exposure to Shahbazyan. We're going to move on to the final segment here, which is our money-making segment, and that is going over my ideal lineup for DraftKings this Saturday night. And we're going to start off with Edmund Shahbazyan at that 9,100 salary. So I want to lock him in. I'm expecting an early finish, anywhere from 90 to 110 points. I will then lock in Vicente Luque at 8,800. Again, I expect a finish from him. I think it's likely against Randy Brown. Even if we don't see a finish there, I don't think Brown will be able to finish him. And Luque is always good for a high amount of volume and a decent amount of significant strikes. So 8,800 salary looks really good on this slate. And I think we could see anywhere from, 80 to 100 points. As long as he wins the fight, because the guy has some vicious power in his hands. After Luque, I will be locking in Jonathan Martinez at 8,600. Now, we talked a little bit earlier when I went over Joanne Calderwood that you're going to have to make a decision here if you want a fighter in that price point. Is it Jonathan Martinez? Is it Joanne Calderwood? Vicente Luque? I have 2 of those guys. And I decided to go with Martinez here, and that's just because I'm pushing the salary to the limit. I really like both of them in this fight. I think Martinez is probably going to dust Frankie Saenz, who is 40 years old and is coming off of a pretty long layoff. My only concern is that Saenz probably is the better grappler, so if he is able to make it a sloppy fight and take down Martinez, that would suck for 2 reasons. 1, it might lead to a victory for Saenz, but 2, those fights tend to not have a bunch of output. But as long as Martinez can stuff the takedowns, he'll have an advantage in striking, and I think he has an advantage in jiu-jitsu as well, so really like him there. After Jonathan Martinez, I like Marcus Perez at 8,500. Really love Marcus Perez on this slate. Eric Spicely is not a UFC fighter, in my opinion. His grappling and his striking is just horrible. He's so one-dimensional. He's like a Damian Maia, but doesn't have as strong as jiu-jitsu. And I think Marcus Perez is better than him just about everywhere, arguably outside of jiu-jitsu, but Marcus Perez isn't a slouch in that area either. So 8,500 is not a bad price to pay for Marcus Perez, because he should certainly win that fight, and Spicely's shown that he can be finished in the UFC. After Marcus Perez, I have Jamal Emmers at 7,800, and this was really one of the most difficult ones to put in my lineup, because when I was constructing this lineup, it really came down to Jamal Emmers or Trevin Giles, and then Jonathan Martinez and Joanne Calderwood. I'm going to go with Emmers in this one just because I feel as though this fight is more likely to go the distance, and if it goes the distance, it's more likely to favor Emmers than a fight where Giles goes the distance versus Holland. So Emmers has that significant size advantage, and if he lands a decent amount of strikes, he should put up some points. Hopefully he gets the victory as well, get that 30-point bonus, and I want to see Jamal Emmers have 70 to 80 fantasy points. That would make me pretty happy at a 7,800 price point. Whereas Trevin Giles, if he doesn't get the finish, it's going to be difficult, I think, for him to win that fight. And then my last fighter in my lineup here is Nate Maness, who, making his UFC debut, but again, I'm really trying to take advantage of his size advantage over Ray Borg and his finishing potential. Ray Borg has, as I mentioned earlier, struggles against bigger fighters. Nate Maness has good wrestling background, which is what I like to see, and he also has solid finishing potential. He's shown that he can knock fighters out. He's also shown that he can sub fighters. I don't know if I expect Ray Borg to be finished in this fight, but if this fight were to be finished early, I would think it would be from Nate. I think he has a chance to potentially knock out Ray Borg. So that would be really nice to see at that 7,200 price point. I think Maness can win this fight if it goes the distance. I think he can win this fight if it's stopped early. So I really like him at 7,200. So again, my lineup: Shahbazyan, Luque, Martinez, Perez, Jamal Emmers, and then Nate Maness. Let's get back on the winning side of things this weekend after a rough card last weekend, and I'm pretty confident in this card, even though it's a weird one. It's a weird one. You have a lot of close fights, and a lot of times those types of cards in GPPs, you just have to pick the right fighters, which is difficult. But I'll have a couple lineups as always, and thanks everyone for tuning in. If you could hit that like button, smash that subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. And also check me out on Twitter at TheManchise or you can also check me on Spotify, any platform for podcasts. It's the Manchise Podcast. All right, catch you guys next weekend.